This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for Monday, February 12th, 2018, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Cristina Roach.
Hey, checkers.
And producer Pat.
Hi, everyone.
We have three interesting segments for you, as usual. I'm going to look into a bit of the fallout from the solar eclipse. Then Adam is going to explore the bicameral mind.
That's right.
I'm intrigued. And finally, Cristina is going to examine whether eHarmony is backed by science. But first, a quick note about donations. As you know, we've been running some ads to generate some income for the podcast, but we also have a donation button if people would like to sponsor us directly. Someone wrote asking us, do we have a Patreon account? And previously we hadn't had one because we thought the 5% charge of Patreon was a bit higher than the 3% charge of PayPal. But we also thought it's better to give people more options. So we're currently putting together an elementary Patreon account for you to use, and that is available at patreon.com/therealitycheck. Once again, we really just want to have more people listen to the show, and if you want to financially support us, that'd be great. And if you want to use Patreon, now you have a chance to do so. And now on with the show. Remember that solar eclipse that everyone was all excited about? It happened on August 21st, 2017. And of course you remember it because on episode 463 of The Reality Check, Cristina covered eclipse myths. Remember also the many warnings that were given by medical professionals and scientists that everyone should be careful and not stare at the sun unless they had appropriate eye protection. And some even warning that no one should look at it just to be safe. Well, a friend sent me a story in the Washington Post about an unfortunate woman that had her eyes damaged during the eclipse, and you're going to get a synopsis of that article. The story describes 26-year-old Staten Island resident Nia Payne, who was looking at the eclipse when it was about 70% covered. She looked for about 6 seconds before thinking she should really put on protective glasses. Smart thinking. Yeah. She put on some and then looked for about 15 to 20 seconds more. Unfortunately, they were not the right glasses.
Oh,
they were like sunglasses or what?
It doesn't specify. For the next 2 days, in the center of her vision, Payne saw a black spot similar in shape to the eclipse's crescent. She sought medical help and eventually ended up at Mount Sinai having her retina scanned to assess the situation. For some background, retinopathy is any damage to the retina of the eyes, which may cause vision impairment. Diabetic retinopathy is the most common cause of this. There is a much less common type called solar retinopathy. Good old Wikipedia says that solar retinopathy, also known as photic retinopathy, is damage to the eye's retina, particularly the macula, from prolonged exposure to solar radiation or other bright light, like lasers or arc welders. The term is synonymous with retinal phototoxicity and usually occurs due to staring at the sun, watching a solar eclipse, or other bright light. Nia Payne was diagnosed with this by the Mount Sinai doctors, noting the damage was worse in her left eye. As part of the diagnostic process, they asked Payne to draw the black spot she saw. She drew a crescent shape that was similar in shape to the eclipse. Interesting, almost intuitive, but is that how it really works? The Washington Post piece states that, quote, Mount Sinai has a precise imaging machine that uses adaptive optics, which can examine individual cells of the retina, which only recently has become an ophthalmology tool. This machine was used to look at the retina's photoreceptor layer, which turns sunlight into information. Perhaps think of photoreceptor as photon receptor, not like the torpedoes. Light energy hits the eye, goes through an interesting but complicated process to turn that energy into energy the brain can use to understand the world. The doctors found that the sun had actually burned a crescent onto Payne's retina.
Oh.
This aligned with the drawing Payne had made.
Wow.
This finding was so novel that it led to a publication in JAMA Ophthalmology, where the lead author said that no previously published research had found patients whose eyes were damaged by a solar eclipse in this way. While this finding may help treatment, at the moment the damage is permanent. Payne is trying to use her right eye more, but is suffering in various ways where reading and even watching TV are difficult. On top of that, she told CNN that, quote, it's embarrassing. People will assume I was just one of those people who stared blankly at the sun or didn't check the person with the glasses. It's something I have to live with for the rest of my life, she added. The lesson here is unless you are really certain that you have the right eye protection, don't look at the sun. I do hope things get better for Payne. Hopefully, solace can come from this story serving as a warning to others.
Man. Well, Adam, you asked, was it sunglasses? But if you remember when I did that segment, there's a lot of fake glasses on the market. Yeah. So it's really important to check with the right, on the right websites, to make sure that the glasses have the proper warning or whatever the code is.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know the ones I used, they were cheap cardboard ones, but basically years ago when there was I think it was the Venus Transit, I bought an astronomy magazine that had these glasses in them, and they're good, they work, but yeah, I guess you gotta be sure.
I was starting to wonder if it's really worth the risk. Even someone's like, yeah, you can trust these. Like, is it worth it? No.
The Eclipse is really cool, though.
The Eclipse is really cool. To see it in person does add something, but is it worth it?
Yeah.
I saw a lot of people posting that they were going to use like welding goggles or welding masks, but even at that, it has to be at a certain level. Like even sometimes those aren't good enough.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's always the pinhole camera, and
Right.
I did kind of a cheap version of that. I just had a little piece of aluminum foil that I pricked a little hole in and put it on a piece of paper, and it's cool, and you can see the crescent, but it's tiny.
It's not quite the same.
Looking at it,
it's not quite the same. And it's so tempting. Just for a moment, I'll just look up. Even with sunsets, sometimes like, oh, nice sunset. Then I look somewhere else and I can't see because I have a spot in front of my eyes.
Yeah.
What is it about human nature that we just dismiss warnings from people who are so much smarter than ourselves and just go, nah, I've got tiger blood, I'll be fine, or even just, I can't be that bad, they must be exaggerating it. I don't know what it is, but a lot of people do that, so. Well,
sometimes I just don't. Depending on the warning, sometimes I just think, oh, they just got put there because of lawsuits, right?
Right.
You just ignore it. But it depends on what that warning is. If the warning is like, don't eat a Tide Pod, it's probably legit,
Probably, Adam says. Add that qualifier from the other side of the skepticism. So, Adam, sometimes when I hear my own thoughts, I think I'm conscious, and other times I think it's a god. Does this have anything to do with the bicameral mind?
You may be schizophrenic, Darren.
Uh-oh.
Let's look into that. A few months ago, when discussing issues of consciousness at a book group I'm part of, someone brought up the issue of bicameralism, or the bicameral mind. This idea was completely new to me, but I found it fascinating and knew I needed to know more. The basic idea, as proposed by Julian Jaynes, is that the development of consciousness was fairly recent, and the predecessor to conscious thought was bicameralism, whereas a sort of internal voice from one's own mind commands people to do things, and that such voices were often mistaken for the voices of the gods. This idea would explain why in ancient history and literature people and characters seem to literally speak to gods, and that these gods were actually part of their own mind, which ultimately led to consciousness. The idea was explained to me as almost certainly being complete nonsense, but there was a small possibility that was actually brilliant. Now, Richard Dawkins mentions the idea in his book The God Delusion and said something similar, and I quote, "It is one of those books that is either complete rubbish or a work of consummate genius, nothing in between, probably the former, but I'm hedging my bets." Now, frankly, if someone like Richard Dawkins can say something like this about it certainly sounded interesting to me. Upon rewatching the HBO series Westworld, there were many references to this idea. I'd seen them before, but I guess they didn't really register. Without getting too much into spoilers, the story is about hosts, these robots, and it deals with issues of consciousness. A character states that the idea of bicameralism to describe the origin of human consciousness had been debunked, but that the theory proved to be a good blueprint for bootstrapping consciousness in a machine, a sort of artificial consciousness. This idea of the hosts hearing voices and what those mean is presented throughout the series, and this culminates in the season finale, whose episode title is The Bicameral Mind. And watching some of the bonus material on the home video version, series creator and writer Jonathan Nolan repeatedly mentions the idea as put forward by Julian Jaynes, and so naturally I sought to read his 1976 book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. To say we don't understand exactly what consciousness is or how it works would be an understatement, so it's hard to definitively accept or reject such an idea. But all considered, I think it's safe to say that bicameralism, as explained in the book, is not likely a real phenomenon, and that consciousness as we know it is likely not as recently developed as the theory suggests, which has consciousness only being around for about the last 3,000 years. Still, the idea was interesting, so I wanted to present a rough idea with a few criticisms. Though it's a very complex idea, I can't hope to touch on all the specifics in this short segment. Now, there's a lot of consideration for the brain and neuroanatomy in the book. The name bicameral really is referring to the two halves of the brain. The voices would originate from the right brain and would be heard by the left brain, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain. The author did a lot of research into schizophrenia and believes that this condition is a holdover from bicameralism. His explanations on exactly how this might work are somewhat compelling, but without an actual underlying reason to think this idea has merit, the explanation might be unnecessary. So with a lot of this theory, there's a lot of things that's like, if it's true, this kind of lines up, but nothing's really strong enough to convince me this is true. There's no like big trigger for me there. Now, he argues that language led to bicameralism, and in turn, that bicameralism led to consciousness. His ideas on how language and metaphor are unique to conscious thought are compelling. That said, these can relate to the origins of consciousness without bicameralism being necessary. For example, Daniel Dennett's recent book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, The Evolution of Minds, he argued that language and consciousness would have evolved together, sort of like playing off of each other. Ultimately, he feels that bicameralism and consciousness are learned rather than evolved, and I have a bit of trouble with this premise. Would a person devoid of any contact with other conscious people not develop consciousness? Now, if consciousness would learn, that would be true. Now, this is a bit too blank slate a view of consciousness in my mind. Still, Janes attempts to present precedent for this with other aspects of the mind. He cites hypnotism as an example, and he shows that the behaviors that people exhibit while in a hypnotic state are only consistent with what they believe a hypnotized person should do, for example. Similarly, a conscious person would learn to be conscious based on how other conscious people around them act.
Can we also say that if you happen to believe that consciousness requires language, and you aren't exposed to other people who are speaking language, therefore you probably wouldn't really acquire language, and therefore you wouldn't be conscious, if you consider that a necessary precondition.
Sure. Yeah, so it's a little tricky, right? It's like saying, that there's this idea that if you, or there used to be this idea that if you would sort of raise someone in a cave and never talk to them, that they would still develop a language. And I don't think that has much merit, but that's not to say that our minds don't sort of have the software or whatever you want to call it to learn language. So sort of like a preset way of thinking that makes us more susceptible to language because we would have evolved in an environment with language and adapted to it. And that's why you can't just teach a dog to understand language, for example, even if it can understand words.
Correct. I think almost everyone thinks that there's some sort of genetic predisposition for language acquisition.
Yeah.
Maybe not the full-on language acquisition device of Chomsky, but in general, yes. Otherwise, yeah, as you said, you can't. It doesn't work.
Yeah. So similarly, if we're talking about consciousness, if we're going to learn consciousness, you would almost have to evolve a predisposition to being conscious, and that sort of evolution over natural selection isn't going to happen in the last 3,000 years, especially since different groups of humans split off long before that. Now, a bit of the specifics on how bicameralism would work. Now, this idea more specifically is not exclusively about listening to the voices of gods. That's a big aspect, and that's usually how you hear it presented. Rather, it is suggested as a structure for a small society in which a hierarchy is in place, and the bicameral voices one hears are that of a person superior. So a king may hear the bicameral voice of a god, but the king's subordinates would hear a bicameral voice and assume it was of their king. And going down that hierarchy, the people would all be hearing voices, and they would think that they are of the certain authority that is around them in their lives. Now, this isn't a voice as a suggestion, but sort of as an inevitable compulsion. The bicameral man would, as the idea suggests, not actually have the ability to question or deny the voice, because that would require consciousness. The voice commands, there's no consciousness to question it, this person simply obeys it. And he attempts to draw parallels to the strength of the authority of a voice of a schizophrenic patient, for example, as being equivalent to that. The underlying evidence for all this is something he shows to be found throughout history and fiction. Bicameralism came about with early language, and eventually consciousness came about with language and writing as we know it today. He attempts to demonstrate differences in how people interacted in early writings, and even words and concepts that weren't around in cultures which he sees as being bicameral. The obvious example that he gives, and that is usually cited when overviewing his idea, is Homer's Iliad. In this story, the characters literally follow commands issued by the gods. He uses this and other examples to attempt to illustrate how civilizations used to be bicameral. He even gets into the Old Testament and other such religious texts to demonstrate how fundamentally different people used to think and act in a way which seems puzzling except when looked at through the lens of bicameralism. It's somewhat convincing, but generally I have a hard time with any older history. It's just not my area of expertise. But when I read about how people came to understand how things were based on older writings, I find it frustrating how flimsy some of the evidence can really be, since we have a very narrow view of what happened and really have to infer a lot of it, because we just have a small glimpse of what's going on with the writings that have remained since then. When it comes to historical examples, he cites things like how easily people in older cultures believed in oracles, which he believes is a holdout over of bicameral times, in which people literally heard the voices of gods, making the concept of an oracle that much more convincing. Ultimately, the whole point of this argument is to transition into the conscious mind. It has to be an explanation for consciousness. Bicameral civilizations work with a certain hierarchy, but when such civilizations collapse, bicameralism can't withstand that. Now, it's hard for me to give his full argument justice, but he again cites examples for this difference. In bicameralism, the gods aren't questioned, they are simply the authority. When bicameralism breaks down, we start to see concepts like demons, gods who might be flawed, people questioning gods, prayer, things like that. So bicameralism not only explains consciousness, but also the origins of religion. So in modern time, God seems to have disappeared, yet they're all over the Old Testament. His reasoning is simply that they were always present and heard at the time of the Old Testament. This became less and less common with prophets and oracles during the transition, and now they're almost not heard at all. Needless to say, Julian Jaynes is an atheist. He doesn't think these voices are actually of gods. He thinks they come from people's minds. Now, one issue that seemed to be an obvious problem before reading this book to me was, if consciousness really did develop so recently, wouldn't that mean many hunter-gatherer tribes weren't conscious? 3,000 years is long after sort of humans split and went their own ways around the globe. Indeed, he argues for just that. He argues that a reason for which the Mayan people were so easily defeated was because when they were confronted by Spanish invaders, it was a clash between a conscious and bicameral civilization. The bicameral civilization just couldn't wrap their minds around how these people were acting. Now, it's hard for me to come to terms with this, because it would mean that any hunter-gatherer civilization isn't conscious, and that prior to being introduced to Western culture, all of the indigenous people of the Americas, for example, would not have been conscious. It also needs different civilizations throughout the world around 1000 BC, about 3,000 years ago, to have sort of become conscious around the same time. And it's hard to sort of reason that with Asia and things, all happening around the same time. And of course, forget about animals being conscious. Now, he rejects the idea outright early in the book and gives decent arguments for this. Some of the key aspects which are unique to consciousness, as he argues, like situating ideas in time and metaphor, don't seem to be things which animals have any concept of, but it's very hard to understand if animals are actually conscious. Ultimately, we can't know if a specific animal is conscious, let alone if any other person is conscious. They could just be, an automaton or a zombie pretending to be conscious. Of course, it seems only reasonable that all these humans who claim to be conscious actually are, rather than some other convoluted explanation, but we're getting a little too philosophical here, so I'll drop that particular idea.
You never have to apologize for being too philosophical.
Not to you.
I was going to say, okay, Darren.
I'm like, how did a segment on conscious slip by without me doing it?
Now, I'd love to talk about this for another dozen hours or so, but unfortunately, this little overview is the best I can do with the time we have. This is an interesting way to think about history, and if you keep the idea in mind when looking at older texts, you might find some things do make sense when they're thought of through this lens, and a lot of what he presents in the book works that way. That said, I don't think the basic premise has much scientific plausibility, but even if the main idea is unfounded, the book still has a lot of discussion and insight into consciousness and psychology, which is useful, evidence-based, and valid. It would be hard for me to plainly classify this as pseudoscience. I can't find much in the way of bulletproof takedowns of the idea, like I do for many other kinds of things we talk about on the show. It's probably on the spectrum between pseudoscience and science, and while we can't rule it out completely without a time machine, there are still some claims which the idea is dependent upon, which we can examine, and it seems like some of them don't hold up to scrutiny. Still, a fun idea, an enjoyable book, and an important concept to consider if you want to get the most out of HBO's Westworld.
Well done, Adam. Dennett, who I'm a huge fan of, has often given Julian's belief about bicameral mind a sympathetic treatment, mainly because Dennett is also a large fan of the general idea of something had to happen somehow to get to where we are. Like, we started with, way back when, before there was life, there was a bunch of rocks, then there were macromolecules, and now we have beings with thoughts, feelings, meaning, and happiness. And how did you get from A to B? Somewhat similarly, there was a time where people probably didn't talk to themselves much internally, and then they did. There's also a time where they literally heard gods, and now most of us don't. So something had to happen to get from A to B to C to D. That's why Dena thought this was a very interesting idea that at least is useful for idea generation, even if it isn't true.
To me, the question really is, what does consciousness mean, right? Like, that's kind of a little bit open to interpretation. Is it self-awareness? Like,
maybe it's time for another segment on consciousness.
And some reviews of his IDF basically said that he defines consciousness as this, whereas, modern philosophers define it as this, and here's why that's a problem, whatever. But the way he explains it in the book, I think, makes sense, at least internally, with regards to his theory.
Send your questions and comments to adam@trcpodcast.com.
His right brain will tell his left brain how to answer. Well, Julian Jaynes may not be fully backed by science, but at least eHarmony is. Right, Cristina?
So this story hit my radar last month when I read a news article published by The Independent's science correspondent, Josh Kabatis. Seeing as it's about online dating, I thought it would be a nice little tie-in with Valentine's being this week. So last July, eHarmony, a popular online dating company, put up a billboard ad on a London, UK underground platform for their service. It featured the following headline claim: "Step aside, fate. It's time science had a go at love." It went on to state, imagine being able to stack the odds of finding lasting love entirely in your favor. eHarmony's scientifically proven matching system decodes the mystery of compatibility and chemistry so you don't have to. Why leave the most important search of your life to chance? Try something different today. Join eHarmony.co.uk. Wow, single people, the search to find your perfect partner is over. Thank you, science. Not really. This is the reality check after all. Presumably, tens of thousands of people saw this ad, considering the site for London's Underground states that the tube handles up to 5 million passenger journeys per day. So thankfully, one of those passengers happened to be Lord Lipsey, the joint chairman of the All-Parliamentary Group on Statistics, and more notably, a former member of the ASA Council, which stands for Advertising Standards Authority, UK's independent regulator, i.e. watchdog, of advertising across all media.
So this is the kind of person that pays attention to billboard ads.
Right. So he promptly lodged a complaint about the ad, which was subsequently banned by the ASA. He called it misleading and stated he didn't believe it was possible to claim scientific proof about a dating system. He told news outlets like Sky News, who reported on the story, that, quote, phrases like scientifically proven should be confined to claims that are just that, not used in crude puffery designed to lure in those longing for love. This is a new form of fake news, which the ASA has rightly slapped down.
Crude puffery is pretty good.
He has a way with words,
I have a follow-up question. Is he single?
Uses OkCupid.
So, how can eHarmony possibly claim they use science to find your perfect match?
Because everyone claims that science backs their thing and it doesn't need to be true.
Right. Well, according to them, they use a compatibility matching algorithm based on scientific theories. Romain Bertrand, the managing UK director for the company, states, quote, eHarmony was conceived on the premise that science and research could be harnessed to help people find love. For over 17 years, eHarmony has been matching singles into high-quality, long-lasting relationships based upon sophisticated matching standards designed by PhD psychologists.
All that can be true.
Yes.
Just not actually
Right.
effective and truly scientifically backed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in challenging the ASA's decision to ban the ad, the company submitted their granted patent for their algorithm, as well as 2 published studies, said with air quotes, which they believed back up their claim by reporting higher levels of marital satisfaction for couples who met through eHarmony than any other offline or online source. They went on to state in their defense that they believed consumers would interpret the ad to mean its scientific approach maybe could work for them, not guarantee a lasting love connection. Thankfully, the ASA wasn't buying it. Now, here's an excerpt from ASA's ruling, which was published early January 2018. And of course, I'll link to it in its entirety. eHarmony UK said that the definition of science was something that was based on or characterized by the methods or principles of science. The company explained that their algorithm was based on data collected from more than 50,000 married couples in 23 different countries, which looked at their core personality traits and key values. Their research resulted in statistical models which were associated with cut-off thresholds for scores that indicated a high probability of successful relationships if married. They said the algorithm was based on scientific theories in the relationship literature of assortative mating. ASA went on to say that neither study provided insight into the likelihood of the website finding users lasting love compared to users who did not use the service. Quote, because the evidence provided by eHarmony did not demonstrate that their matching system offered users a significantly greater chance of finding lasting love than what could be achieved if they didn't use the service, we concluded that the claim, scientifically proven matching system, was misleading. The ad breach CAP code rules 3.1, misleading advertising, 3.7, substantiation, and 3.11, exaggeration. Now, as a result, the ASA ruled that eHarmony could no longer use the claim scientifically proven matching system, nor any similar claims without adequate evidence that their website offers users a significantly greater chance of finding lasting love than what could be achieved if they didn't use the service. Now, speaking of love, I love this outcome. This is what we do on the show every week. But I'd be a little bit more excited about this coup if I hadn't noticed a very interesting distinction between the verbiage on the homepage of eHarmony's websites in Canada versus the UK. Oh. Let me know if you guys can spot the difference. Here's a blurb from the homepage of eHarmony's UK site. We take the time to get to know you and discover what is really important in your life so that we can bring you really meaningful matches. With 35 years of experience in bringing people together, we constantly work to refine our matching process and find you a date which will last a lifetime. Now here's the blurb from eHarmony's Canadian homepage. eHarmony is the first service within the online dating industry to use a scientific approach to matching highly compatible singles. eHarmony's matching is based on using its 29 dimensions model to match couples based on features of compatibility found in thousands of successful relationships. By the way, the term 29 dimensions has a registered trademark symbol after it. So I'm not sure if by saying scientific approach, eHarmony in Canada can get away with the wording, but for those of you checkers who are based in Canada, let's find out. I have included a link to Advertising Standards Canada in our show notes. For those of you with itchy keyboard fingers right now, go to trcpodcast.com.
A couple years ago, I read Aziz Ansari's Modern Romance, and one of the things he kind of talked about was the idea that back in the day, people kind of ended up dating like whoever was down the hall or down the street, and they ended up marrying whoever their parents hooked them up with because people just didn't have that many options because the world was smaller. Not literally smaller, but like people's worlds were smaller just because there was less communication. And that these days, people are generally often unsatisfied because they think there's a better option out there, and it can be frustrating. So I wonder if eHarmony's method of sort of only showing you a few matches, even if those matches are almost random, they're not random, but even if they had been random, if that would be better than just sort of like saying, use this site to find whoever you want, simply because by limiting the number of matches, maybe it creates a different sense of the overwhelming options and things like that. You could use science to measure things like that. Right?
The paradox of choice issue comes in. I also read the book, and I do remember that great line is like, in the past, it was just this amazing coincidence that everyone's true love was within 10 miles. What are the odds? And now, for some reason, it's not.
Yeah.
That said, it's clear that they're using math, they're using algorithms, they're using something to match people, which is very science-y.
Right.
It just may not be science.
The idea seems fundamentally sound and appealing. And I think probably when computer dating started, people thought that this would really kind of kill meeting in real life. But, you know, if the past 30 years have been any indication, it doesn't look like online dating has been this silver bullet that sort of makes whoever you meet online that much better than whoever you meet in the real world, because people still do continue to meet compatible people who make them happy outside of their computers. True. Occasionally, apparently.
Alternatively, one of the most saddening things is after having a negative online dating experience, you realize those people exist in the real world. Well, thank you, Cristina. And thanks for listening once again. I covered solar eclipse fallout, so have the right glasses or just don't stare at the sun. Adam explored the bicameral mind, which is a feast for ideas, even though they may not be accurate. And Cristina showed us that eHarmony might be for people who believe science has value without really understanding what it is. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Cubewoods.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
Good night, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.